Welcome, fellow Stardust. Are you ready for a scare? Happy Halloween, Stardust. If you're new here, buckle up, and thank you all for joining me for my final Spooktober special video. My name is DeRay, aka Rainbow Fright, lover of all things dark, creepy, and weird. And with that being said, let's get right into this tier list.
All I could taste was blood and metal.
Hello, Amanda.
Now, I want to start off by saying that I like every entry in the Saw franchise, so it made making a tier list incredibly difficult. There isn't an installment that I don't like. As you can see here, I don't have a category that just says bad. Instead, I have one that says not my favorite. Because what fun is a tier list without some sort of bottom, right? So I'll be counting down from 10 to 1, with 1 being my favorite Saw movie. The Saw franchise is one of my absolute favorite franchises out there, and I have followed it closely since the beginning. The only movie I hadn't seen before this month was a Spiral, and that's because I was just so terrified of not liking a Saw movie. I had heard just so much negative feedback and tidbits about the storyline that just didn't sit well with me, so I procrastinated on watching it, which in hindsight was a huge mistake. How could I have turned my back on the franchise like that? Terrible. So James Wan and Leigh Whannell created something that they didn't know was going to continue on for as long as it has. James Wan directed only the first Saw movie, and Leigh Whannell was involved with the writing up until Saw 3, but they both would continue to be executive producers for each of the installments in the franchise. They were able to acquire investors for the first movie after they shot a short film called Saw, which featured the reverse bear trap and Billy the Puppet. And that exact puppet in the short film is what they use in the feature-length film. And the first Saw movie left me gutted and without hope. When that theme song, Hello Zep, began to play at the end of the movie, my heart was beating out of my chest, and I could not believe that I was watching John Kramer get up off that floor. The ending is one of the most memorable cinematic moments in movie history for me. In fact, I share this with my friend Chris, aka Strange Monkey, in a recent video that he did. He made a compilation video of a bunch of creators talking about the most memorable moments in cinema history for them. I'll leave a link for that video down in the description. After watching Saw, I craved more movies like it. And so when the sequel came out just the next year, I was all over it, along with Hostel. But in comparison to Hostel, Saw has a lot more heart. And I'd say that the Saw franchise and the Jeepers Creepers franchise is what made me come around to sequels and franchises. The idea of sequels and franchises bothered me because the ones that I watched, in my opinion, just seemed like a waste of time and money. But Saw and Jeepers Creepers showed me that it could be done in a positive way. Before Saw and Jeepers Creepers, though, Child's Play and A Nightmare on Elm Street were excluded from my shunning of sequels and franchises. And not only did Saw come out with a sequel the very next year, they came out with a new movie every single year after that until 2010. And then they made their comeback in 2017, again in 2021, and again this year in 2023. And if they come out with another 10 movies in the next 10 years, I will be in the front row for each and every one of them. Saw 2 was announced just days after the release of the original film. People, including myself, went nuts over this movie. They continue to go nuts over it. You can call us gore hounds, torture hounds, whatever you like. Either way, I just love watching these fools try their damnedest to escape these traps and play these gruesome games. The third film was the end of the first trilogy, and 4 through 6 is a trilogy written by Patrick Melton and Marcus Dunstan. They also wrote Saw 3D, aka Saw 7, which was supposed to be 2 movies but ended up just being 1, and was intended to answer any unanswered questions from throughout the franchise. And Jigsaw was the first script written by Josh Stolberg and Peter Goldfinger, who would then go on to write Spiral and Saw X. Well, alright, let's get into this list. Starting at the bottom, we have Jigsaw, which is going to go right here under not my favorite. This is the first film not shot by David A. Armstrong, but instead we have cinematographer Ben Knott, who did his very best to replicate David's work, and I think he accomplishes that. This was also the first time that the directors were not first-time directors or had already directed an installment in the franchise. This time around, we had the Spierig brothers directing, who had also directed Daybreakers. Jigsaw was released in 2017, 7 years after Saw 7, and it takes place 10 years after Saw 7. So we essentially have a fresh new start. We get all new characters except for John Kramer, which he is supposed to be dead, obviously, 10 years later. But of course, we find out at the end of the film, all the scenes with John were just flashbacks that probably took place before Saw 1, even maybe before Cecil's trap with the knives to the face. And we also learned that John Kramer had another apprentice, Logan, who was around before Amanda. So Jigsaw was a bit of an origin story for Jigsaw. Here's some things that I did like about this one. There were so many homages to the previous films in this one. They are scattered everywhere. Just a few. There were 5 players, like in the Saw 5 game. We've got needles, which is surely a tribute to the needle pit from Saw 2. We have another death fake out at the end with Logan and his laser collar, and just so many more. We also return to the origins of John's philosophy, which in later installments starts to get a bit convoluted and a bit self-serving, but in this installment, it's easy to connect with and understand, honoring the value of life and taking accountability for one's actions, having the will to live and having empathy for others and just the bigger picture of the world. It all makes sense. And I'm Team Kramer. Yes, the guy who sold the motorcycle with the faulty brakes maybe didn't deserve to die, but sometimes you're just unlucky. And while I did appreciate Tobin Bell coming back and reprising his role as creepy John Kramer, I was just so confused until the end of the movie. I hated the feeling, when I watched this for the first time, I hated the feeling of just confusion the entire time and why. I did have some ideas of, maybe we went back into the past, but things weren't clicking because things weren't revealed yet. So while it was cool to see him, I didn't like being in the dark for so long. And honestly, for me, it was just so obvious that Logan was the copycat. They tried to throw us off with the red herring with his coworker Eleanor, but I wasn't convinced. I just knew from the jump that Logan was the copycat. Period. We also had Detective Halloran, who was not my favorite. He was pervy and a bit corrupt, and he was just a bad guy chasing bad, and not somebody I wanted to root for. We didn't have our good cops like we had back in the day, Tap, Carrie, Strom. We just had some douche harassing Logan and Eleanor and whoever else he could get his hands on. And the traps in this one were just okay, but I did like the effects of the aftermath of the girl getting stabbed with the needles. That was beautiful. And it was pretty clever what they did with the reverse shotgun with the keys being in there. That was a nice little twist there. And the laser collar, though, was just obviously fake. Even when watching it the first time and you see Logan's lasers go down, nothing is happening to him. And I'm like, okay, well, he's faking his death. What's gonna happen after that? I wasn't tricked by it. So that was kind of a letdown and just a weird moment for me, but it was cool to then see Halloran get the laser collar treatment and have that aftermath just kind of spread out the way that it does. The CGI isn't the best in the world, but it gets the job done. And finding out about this Logan character being the first apprentice before Amanda, for me, just kind of took away from Amanda a little bit. Like, why? And another thing I didn't like was this attempt at comedy, which was carried over from Saw 7. Saw has always just been a more serious and dark, crime-centered franchise, and comedy just doesn't fit in with that vibe. The one-liners in this one just didn't work for me. The filmmakers did a fine job in bringing this franchise back to the silver screen, but I was happy when this storyline wasn't followed up on. So yes, this one will go on to the not my favorite category. Moving on to movie number 9, we have got Saw 7, also called Saw 3D, directed by Kevin Grudert, who also directed Saw 6 and 10, and he also edited Saws 1 through 4, Saw 7, and Saw 10. The writers were Patrick Melton and Marcus Dunstan, who also wrote Saws 4 through 7. So 7 was supposed to be the end of the franchise altogether, and as I mentioned before, it was supposed to be 2 movies. But because Saw 6 didn't do as well as they expected at the box office, they ended up just doing 1 movie instead. Kevin Grudert was set to direct Paranormal Activity 2, but the studio had suddenly dismissed David Hackle from set and forced Kevin back into the director's seat for Saw 7 on the basis of a contractual clause causing him to pass up the Paranormal 2 opportunity. Of course, this made him upset, which makes it interesting that he would return as the editor for Jigsaw and the director-editor for Saw 10. I think that shows just how much he loves this franchise and how much he loves those coins in his pockets. However, David Hackle would also later return as a visual consultant for Spiral. So in this one, in Saw 3D, which I will put down here as not my favorite, we've got Bobby Dagan, the fake Jigsaw survivor. So this guy had the bright idea that he would make it famous and make a lot of money by claiming he went through one of Jigsaw's traps. And in the Saw timeline, he decides to go public with this story between Saw 1 and Saw 2. But Saw 7 is actually taking place after Saw 3, after John's death. So Bobby Dagan's game is being facilitated by Mark Hoffman. After Bobby went public with his bogus story, John Kramer caught wind of it and even went to Bobby Dagan's book signing for his book called Survive and met face to face with Bobby. And Bobby had no idea who he was dealing with. So the game that we see Bobby go through in this installment had been planned for a very long time. We're also watching Hoffman chase Jill around, who in the previous film, in Saw 6, put him in the reverse bear trap, and we got to see his mouth get ripped wide open. In 6, it was also discovered that John wanted Jill to give Hoffman his final test by putting him in that reverse bear trap. So of course he is after her to get his revenge. So Jill then confides in internal affairs because she does not trust the police or the FBI because of Hoffman. So then we're introduced to Detective Gibson, who's got this comedic vibe that is just not working for me. He is so annoying, and he doesn't do a good job at protecting Jill because in the end, Hoffman gets her. And sadly, he puts her in the reverse bear trap, but she is unable to escape. And as sad as it is to see Jill pass, finally getting to see that reverse bear trap fully in action is oh so satisfying. So with this installment, I really did love this idea of someone faking their survival from a jigsaw trap. Kind of a good idea at first thought, but he probably should have waited till the killer was captured to come out about it. John wasn't pronounced dead until at least a year or two after he decided to come out with his bogus story. But I guess either way, whether he waited for John to die or not, he was still screwed because of John's apprentices. I also really loved the concept of the traps where we had the see no evil, speak no evil, and hear no evil, and the different traps that went with those different phrases. The vocal cord one, so good. I get mad at her every time too. Like, yo, why are you yelling? Let me rip your vocal cords out without you screaming, please.
Shut the fuck up!
We also had some teeth pulling, which is always hard to watch, but oh, they did it so good. And we also had Chester Bennington and his friends getting their comeuppance. And we also get our first glimpse at a Saw shrine. At the police station, we have all the artifacts from previous films all in one place. And it is so lovely to look at. The Saw shrine is something that we also see in Jigsaw as well as Spiral. I also like Saw 7 because we get to see more Jill in action. Although she does get killed by Hoffman at the end, Hoffman also finally gets his when we see Dr. Gordon kidnap him, letting us know that he is the next apprentice. They sure gave us quite the twist for a movie that was supposed to wrap up the series. And so let's see, things that I really didn't like about this one. You know, just a personal thing. I didn't like Hoffman killing Jill. It was just terrible. Hoffman just constantly getting away with shit. I was over it. So yes, Gordon finally capturing him, also very satisfying. And again, we've got this comedy that is creeping in that just is a bit corny. But funny enough, rewatching this movie had me thinking about Malignant, which I absolutely love. With Malignant, that campy comedy vibe works, but not for a franchise that is just established as something more serious and dark. On top of that, everything just feels really rushed and that there is too much going on, and that's likely because this is 2 movies put into one. So all in all, Saw 7 is a fun addition to the franchise, but I don't fault anyone for staying away from this one. So Saw 7 I will put into not my favorite. Next, we have a Spiral coming in at number 8. So as I previously mentioned, I had just watched this installment a couple of weeks ago, and I had heard a lot of negative feedback, and I just was not prepared to flat out not like my first Saw movie. And so when watching it the first time, I was frustrated that it didn't look or feel like a Saw movie. But afterwards, I did some research on the production of the film and had a change of heart and rewatched it, and then fell in love with it. So randomly at a film event, Chris Rock met Lee Whannell and told him that he was a huge Saw fan and told him that he'd be one day making a Saw movie. Lee didn't think much of that quick interaction, but would soon find out that Chris wasn't joking when he went to Lionsgate executive Michael Burns with his idea and was intrigued by it. The rest of the producers at Lionsgate liked the idea of a Spiral being a standalone film and the first film without John Kramer in it. Although the idea of Kramer somehow showing up on screen was on the table up until the first day of shooting, but it was ultimately decided against. Writers of the previous film, Josh Stolberg and Peter Goldfinger, and Twisted Pictures producers were already trying to come up with an idea for the next installment, focusing on Kramer/Jigsaw's origin story. which would later then become Saw X, but it was put on hold by Michael Burns at Lionsgate in order to execute Chris's idea. So Chris worked closely with Josh and Peter on the script, doing rewrites where he saw fit, and every director in the Saw franchise except for the Spierig brothers were involved in Spiral as producers, including Lee Whannell. Spiral was directed by Darren Lynn Bousman, who directed Saws 2 through 4, some of the best in the franchise. And while this installment didn't feel or look like a Saw movie right away, upon closer observation and better understanding of the movie's goals, you can certainly feel the Saw DNA in this one. So in this story, we have Chris Rock's character, Zeke, who is a good cop, but he is surrounded by corrupt cops, his old partners, his father, even his boss. Then we have his new rookie partner, Shank, played by Max Minghella, and we see them basically try to track down this new copycat killer. In this world, everybody knows about John Kramer / Jigsaw and know that he has been long dead. So when corrupt cops are found in traps all over the city and Zeke and Shank are assigned to investigate, they know they have a Jigsaw copycat on their hands. And it turns out that the copycat killer is Shank himself. As a small child, he had set out to exact revenge for his father's death, who was shot and killed by Peter Dunleavy, a corrupt cop who was trying to cover up his tracks. Now the comedy in this one works. With it being a standalone film, it could break some rules here and there and still have that Saw DNA. I really enjoyed the hip hop and the levity of it all, and seeing Chris Rock in this type of role. I really just also love this idea of the Saw franchise spinning off into these different worlds. There could be infinity movies. I also liked how we are shedding some light on police corruption, and this movie was actually supposed to be released in 2020, but because of everything that was going down during that time, the release date was pushed back to 2021. And during that time, 2020 and 2021, I'm sure was part of the reason why this movie didn't do so well at the box office. It was either perfect timing or really bad timing, however you want to look at it. Spiral also has a ton of nods to the previous film, just like Jigsaw does. We've got the plastic door dividers that we see in 3. We've got a support group like we saw in 7. We've also got another Saw shrine like we saw in 7 and in 8, Jigsaw. And of course, we see Zeke chained up to a pipe, which is reminiscent of Saw 1. Making the decision to use a digitized voice was crucial. Had they tried to replicate it or make it sound almost like John, just would have been a huge mess that I'm sure would have pissed off a lot of people, especially since this was supposed to be a standalone film. And with that, we also don't get Billy the puppet, but we instead get Mr. Snuggles, a pig that is on some marionette strings. And ooh, is he just as creepy. And this time around, pigs are likely to represent the corrupt cops versus John's initial meaning of rebirth. Things I didn't like about Spiral were the lackluster traps. They were kind of fun, but they just could have been better. And it's really hard to root for anyone in this movie, even Chris Rock's character, because all of his friends are corrupt. We have one cop who to him was like a family member, but he was just a really low down, dirty cop. Like, where's your judgment, Chris? Even his father, Samuel L. Jackson, just is not a likable character. Nobody in that police station is a good cop. But Chris definitely is our protagonist. It's just unfortunate that he lives in a life where nobody is like him. So Spiral is going to go in my like category. And let's see. So next, we have Saw 4. So Saw 4 is 7th on my list and was the first film that wasn't written by Lee Whannell, but he was one of the executive producers along with James Wan, as you know. So producers then brought in writers Marcus Dunstan and Patrick Melton after reading their script The Collector, originally titled The Midnight Man, which they hoped would be picked for the next installment in the Saw franchise. And they wanted it to be the origin story of Jigsaw. While the script was ultimately rejected, they would get hired on to write the next 3 films, which they intended to be a trilogy. So technically the second trilogy in the franchise. They would also go on to write Saw 7. Now in 4, we have got a whole lot going on. We find out that 3 and 4 are happening on the same timeline. We find out that Hoffman is an apprentice and Strom is going after Hoffman. Detective Matthews is finally killed. John Kramer's lawyer Art is the new Zepp. We find out that a recovering drug addict named Cecil killed John's unborn baby Gideon. So John kidnaps him during the Chinese New Year celebration in 1995, the year of the pig. The first 3 Saw movies is a perfect trilogy, but if you're gonna bring a story back to life, Saw 4 is how you do it. They brought the story back without changing the DNA. They made the world a little bigger and gave us some more background and answers to questions that we might have had in the first 3 movies. The answers made sense and they were clever. For instance, the barbed wire cage. I loved seeing the beginnings of that trap. We get characters from Saw 2 and Saw 3 in Saw 4 that help to meld these worlds together. The traps stayed horrific, and we also still got our fun transitions from one room to another, and we got a little bit more of Jill, who we only saw glimpses of in 3. It was fun getting more of her background and seeing her character develop a bit. However, I wasn't a big fan of Riggs's trial and his game. It just, to me, seemed unwinnable. There was no way he would just let somebody sit where they were and walk away. He was always going to move forward no matter what, essentially making his game unwinnable, which sort of made the lesson a bit of a boring one, but the traps within the lesson were fun. I did like seeing Homeboy get his eye poked out and then his limbs ripped off. The scalping was fun, but the lesson that Riggs is trying to learn is just kind of And Matthews' character has always just been so super annoying to me. I wish he had died sooner, but I was happy to see his head get popped like a grape. And I'm not sure if Art kind of being like Zepp's character is a nod or homage to the first movie, or if it's just a recycled idea, but it didn't quite sit well with me just for the simple fact that there was just so much going on in that room and so much is being revealed. It was a bit much, but maybe having all of these things going on all at once is a good thing as a jump start to getting back into a franchise that was supposed to have ended. But for me, there was just so many moving parts that there may have been 1 or 2 things that could have been taken out to make it a little bit less convoluted. But otherwise, it was a great start to a second trilogy. So Saw 4 is going to go under like. All right, we are moving on to our 6th position, which is Saw 5. So this is the directorial debut of David Hackle, who was supposed to direct Saw 4, but when he was offered the position, his wife was diagnosed with cancer. So then he was offered to direct Saw 5 and Saw 6, but he would only end up directing Saw 5. David was the production designer of Saws 2 through 4, so he was really eager to take on this directing role. This is also the first film not edited by Kevin Grudert, but instead was edited by Andrew Koltz, who then edited Saws 6 and 7. Here we have our second group game, but this time we have just 5 players instead of 8, likely a nod to this one being the 5th film. But this group of people have something much more sinister in common than the folks in Saw 2. They were all connected to a building that was burned down that had 8 people inside. One of them was the one who physically set the building on fire, and the rest of them were involved in covering it up one way or another to their benefit. We also learned the reason why Hoffman became John's apprentice. Hoffman was actually blackmailed by John to become his apprentice because he had set up a copycat jigsaw trap for his sister's murderer, and John didn't want to have any association with that subpar trap unless Hoffman agreed to help him set up future games. And with John in the middle of dying, he needed the help. Strom, meanwhile, is suspicious of Hoffman and is on his tail since Saw 4. Unfortunately, Hoffman the entire time leaves breadcrumbs for Detective Erickson, Strom's boss, that leads him to believe that Strom is instead John's new apprentice. Erickson takes the bait, and Strom is crushed when he doesn't follow the instructions on the tape when he and Hoffman have their last battle in the compressor with the glass box. I really loved how this was a tribute to the fallen officers from previous films, Tap, Sing, Carrie, and we also have this relationship between Jill and John kind of be validated. The video that is played for Jill that is from John is recorded before Saw 2, and it shows that he still has compassion and love for her, which she wasn't so sure of at the time. I love seeing Strom be a badass throughout this entire installment, and him surviving at the beginning of the movie by poking a hole into his throat was just awesome. It was also really cool seeing Hoffman's involvements in the traps from the very beginning. We have him setting up the barbed wire trap as well as the gun in the nerve house. And I've just also really liked seeing these group games. I like to see how people will interact and react. It's like a bit of a social experiment. And the lesson for this particular game was that they all needed to work together. Nobody had to die in order for the group to progress within the game. This was a fun concept, and it made for a great ending when it was down to just 2 people who had to provide enough blood that 5 people could have easily given. Seeing Homegirl's hand at the end of that, oof, gave me some sympathy pains. I think I was also pretty biased with this group game because Megan Good was in there, and anything with Megan Good, I'm gonna watch it and love it. The group game could have been a bit more bloody, but we do get that gnarly arm, and again, we get Megan Good. All in all, this was a great second movie for this trilogy. Now, for things that I didn't like, I really hate the fact that Hoffman and Strom look so alike. That was really unnecessary. And John's trap for Hoffman when he is blackmailing Hoffman, the trap with the shotgun, could have been a little bit more imaginative. Maybe because sure, he didn't want Hoffman to die, but he could have done something a little bit more interesting than strapping him in a chair with a gun to his face. I mean, come on, John. Other than that, Saw 4 is a good movie. So we're going to put Saw 4 in like. You know what? I actually forgot that I meant to make this called Love a Little Less. That's what this one is supposed to be called. Alright, so 5th on the list is going to be Saw 6, which is the feature debut of Kevin Grudert, who kind of wanted to give the series some closure. The writer Patrick Melton thought that this installment could have been a good end for the franchise, which I would agree with, despite the fact that we have Hoffman at the very end escape the reverse bear trap and his mouth is just ripped open. You know, after 6 Saw movies, it's usually a good idea to kind of leave something a little open like that in case the filmmakers do want to come back with another movie. In this installment, we find out that Detective Perez is actually alive, and if you've ever wondered why she seems so suspicious of Hoffman right at the beginning of the movie, it is because there is an end-credit scene at the end of Saw 6, where we see Amanda telling Corbett to not trust the one who rescues her, knowing that Hoffman would be the one to take her out of where she is locked up. So obviously Corbett tells the paramedics about what Amanda says, which then gets relayed to the detectives. I had no idea that this end-credit scene even existed until I started working on this video. Now it makes sense, but it always drove me crazy as to why she was so suspicious of Hoffman. It made no sense, but I'm glad that it finally does. So while we're happy to see Perez alive, she eventually is killed by Hoffman in a brutal massacre when she and Strom descramble the voice that is on the latest Jigsaw tape and discover that it's Hoffman's voice. However, Hoffman is John's last target, who Jill is assigned to place in the reverse bear trap. Even though he doesn't die, seeing his face get ripped open is another a satisfying moment, because fuck Hoffman. We also have our third group game in the franchise, and like in Saw 3 and Saw 7, these people in the traps don't have the opportunity to free themselves, but instead they are at the mercy of one person who has to choose who lives or dies. And the person doing the choosing this time around is insurance mogul William, who turned down John Kramer's request for health insurance coverage on treatment that might have helped him with his brain tumor. And William is now tasked with choosing which of his employees, also called the dog pit, should live or die. The people he chooses to live aren't who he would grant health insurance coverage to, enforcing the fact that he knows his policies are shit. During the carousel trap, William had to choose who would get shot with the shotgun, which, if you're one of those people sitting on that merry-go-round, knowing you're about to be shot, would be just absolutely terrifying. So watching the last guy tell William to look him in the eye when he's killing him is so gut-wrenching. This commentary on the American healthcare system was timely, because in 2009, when the film was released, us Americans were dealing with a recession. People were losing jobs and thus healthcare coverage. In 2010, Obama had enacted the Affordable Care Act, which aims to make coverage easier and more affordable, but barriers to healthcare still persist. We also get a really great twist in this one. The entire time we think that the mother and son who are being held captive are the family of William, but instead, their husband and father is another man who William denied health coverage to. This man eventually died because he had heart disease. The other woman who was trapped next to the family is actually William's sister, Pamela, who was the reporter in the audience in Saw 5 and gave Jill a mysterious piece of paper before being kidnapped by a piggy. The mom and son are then given the opportunity to kill the man who essentially killed their family member. The wife can't bring herself to do it, but the son has no problem with pulling the lever and letting the acid fall down on William, making him melt away like the slime ball that he is. For the first time, we see Kramer on screen instead of Billy, likely to show William exactly who it was that he fucked over in order to be in the position that he's in. For me, Saw 5 is going to go under love. It's a good one, y'all. It's a real good one. Now we're getting into my top 4, and let me tell y'all, this was incredibly difficult, okay? I can't say that this list is going to be exactly the same next year, but as of right now, this is what I'm feeling. So at number 4, I have Saw 3. And still, it's really hard for me to say that. It's really hard to have Saw 3 be less than number 3. That's the lowest it's ever been on my list. And so having it bumped down to number 4 is a little bit difficult for me because I love this movie so much. James Wan, Lee Whannell, and Darren Bozeman actually turned down the opportunity to make a Saw 3 at first, but producer Greg Hoffman passed away of natural causes only weeks after the release of Saw 2, so the three of them decided to get together and make a Saw 3 in his honor. And of course, Mark Hoffman is named after him. Greg Hoffman would continue to posthumously be credited for all subsequent Saw movies. Saw 3 was given a bigger budget of $10 million compared to Saw's 2 budget of $4 million, and made $10 million more than Saw 2, with $165 million. Saw 2 made $148 million. 3 was meant to be a more emotional film than the first two, and it certainly was. We have this father-daughter relationship between Kramer and Amanda that is disturbing yet tender. This relationship is tested by the character Dr. Lynn Denlin, who is tasked with trying to remove Kramer's brain tumor. Amanda feels threatened by their relationship and goes against John's rules, shooting her, in turn failing her own trap that John had set up for her. He doesn't feel that she is fit to be one of his successors because lately she's been drunk with power and creating unwinnable traps. And he is trying to give her one last chance to prove herself. We're again left with an opportunity for a sequel because we see John swallow this tape covered in wax, and audiences are going to, of course, say, "What the fuck was that?" Also, Jeff's daughter is still alive at the end of the film, and John wouldn't leave a kid to rot and die. We later find out in Saw 6 that Hoffman blackmailed Amanda into shooting Dr. Denlin, threatening to tell John that she was inadvertently involved with the killing of his unborn baby. She was actually Cecil's girlfriend, who she basically forced into breaking into Jill's clinic to steal some drugs. And this is the kind of brilliant writing that I just love throughout the entire franchise. It is just so clever. Dr. Denlin, like Dr. Gordon from the first Saw movie, works at the Angel of Mercy Hospital, where John's x-rays were accidentally mislabeled, causing a misdiagnosis, and when his cancer was finally detected, it was too late. It was already fatal. His doctor, Dr. Gordon, didn't show much concern or sympathy for John and his situation. So for these reasons, Dr. Gordon and Zepp are a couple of his first victims. We later learn in Saw 7 that Dr. Gordon was the one who recruited and kidnapped Dr. Denlin for Kramer. And while we watch the struggle between Dr. Denlin and Amanda, we are also watching Dr. Denlin's husband go through his own trial. Their marriage is revealed as a twist at the end of the movie, which I enjoyed. The traps in Jeff's trial are brutal. We have the icy water, the pig guts in the pit, and the rack, which was the limb twister. We also have the judge getting his face blown off with the shotgun. And if you're wondering why pigs, they represent rebirth in Eastern philosophy, and John seems to include a lot of bits and pieces from Eastern philosophy in his teachings. And the people that Jeff is tasked with saving are those who were involved in his son's death, which occurred when a drunk driver hit him. At first, he doesn't really try hard to save the witness who aided in the driver walking free, which is hard to watch, but it's also hard to not sympathize with Jeff, who just lost his son and only wanted justice to be served. After his failure with the witness, he manages to save the judge, who let his son's killer walk free. But then he fails again when it comes to the man who was behind the wheel, the drunk driver. Seeing Dr. Denlin and Jeff come together at the end of the film sort of knocks the air out of you, because you realize just how much sadness and turmoil is going on within this family and between the 4 people in that room. The couple recently lost their son. Dr. Denlin is having an affair. Dr. Dinlan has also just been shot. Amanda and Kramer are dying together because Amanda couldn't follow through on John's orders after his repeated attempts to reform her and mold her into one of his successors. We've also got Matthews in the background, who escapes the Saw 1 bathroom he was put into in Saw 2. He's left alive for a second time, which also leaves room for another movie, since he already survived being left to die once before. But again, I could care less about Matthews, but it was clever how they were able to bridge the first trilogy with the second trilogy using his character and some others. So Saw 3 is going to go under love. I love it. All right, we are getting into my top 3. The third position is going to go to Saw 2. Now, Saw 2 and Saw 3 are always super neck and neck. They're kind of interchangeable. I'm sure you guys can guess where we're gonna go after this, but yes, Saw 1 is a perfect movie. The trilogy, a perfect trilogy. These two movies, Saw 2 and Saw 3, are completely different, but I love them equally. So it feels really weird to have another movie other than the first one ahead of the both of them. So as mentioned before, Saw 2 was greenlit just days after the release of the original Saw movie. This was the feature debut of Darren Lynn Bousman, who was actually called into the studio because cinematographer David A. Armstrong read his latest script called The Desperate and thought that it was a lot like Saw. Greg Hoffman then showed the script to Twisted Pictures, and they all agreed that this guy would be the guy to write and direct the next movie. At first, Darren thought that they were going to accuse him of plagiarism, but to his surprise, he was able to sell his script and was offered the directing role. As executive producers of Saw 2, James Wan and Lee Wanell spruced up the script a bit and gave it that Saw DNA, but they kept the characters, traps, and the deaths. Darren said that you could read the script for The Desperate and watch Saw 2 and you wouldn't be able to draw any comparisons. And just like the first Saw movie, the filmmakers made sure that we got a twist ending that would shock audiences. To achieve this, they kept the ending a secret from any cast and crew that was not involved in the ending. They also shot up to 5 different endings to keep it a bit ambiguous for those who were involved with the end scenes. And all of the cast and crew were required to sign confidentiality agreements. In Saw 2, we get our first group game, where each individual had their own trap they had to get through in order to get their antidote that was needed to fight the chemical they were currently breathing in that was slowly killing them. We see that Amanda, who was in the previous film, is a part of the group. We're led to think she's relapsed and needs to relearn to appreciate her life. But later, we find out she's a plant, there to make sure Daniel doesn't get hurt, as he is just a pawn for Detective Eric Matthews' trial. The rest of the group are people that Matthews framed in order to get them locked up. So while Matthews did frame these people, they were drug dealers, addicts, and criminals. The kind of people John despised and thought needed salvation. At the same time, we see Matthews interrogate Kramer while the police try to trace the signal of the monitors showing the Nerve House game go down. But it's revealed that what's going on the monitors is a recording, and Daniel was put in a safe to be found at the end of the 2 hours Matthews was given. When killing the drug dealer, Daniel gives us another death fake out like we got in the first film, a tactic we see in many of the installments. The first film gave us a handful of twists and turns, and Saw 2 also delivers on that front. I loved seeing Adam and Dr. Gordon interact and try to beat the other and stay alive, although we saw Adam have empathy for Gordon. Saw 2 was our opportunity to see what a larger group would do in order to survive, who would be out for themselves and who would look out for one another. We also learned more about John's backstory. After being diagnosed with cancer, he attempted to unalive himself by driving off a cliff, but survived. After pulling metal from his body, he found a new appreciation for life and wanted others to feel the same. Even though we were in a new location, we were still in a dark, dingy and disgusting atmosphere in the nerve house. Kramer's space was dark and bleak. The needle pit is one of my absolute favorite traps in the whole franchise. Every time I watch that scene, I swear I can feel Amanda's pain. And watching the drug dealer not make it pisses me off every single time. Why does he stare at that key? We've also got the furnace trap, razor box, peephole handgun, key under the eye, and towards the end, we get Xavier cutting a piece of the back of his neck in order to see the number that's written on it. This was the perfect sequel to the original film, and I really loved how they ended it in the same way, with Amanda delivering the infamous line, "Game over," and slamming the door shut. At this point, between Amanda and Kramer versus Matthews, I'm Team Kramer and Amanda. So that door slam, I'll say this word again, was so satisfying. So, Saw 2 is going to go under best. So good. So good. All right. What do you think has made it to my number 2 position? 10 or the original? 10 or the original? Saw 10 takes the runner-up position, which is directed by a longtime Saw crew member, Kevin Grudert. And the Twisted Pictures producers wanted to go back to their idea from 2008 before Chris Rock's idea was greenlit, and took the story back to Jigsaw's beginnings, with Josh Stolberg and Peter Goldfinger writing their third script for the franchise. So not only does Saw X take us back to the beginnings, it brings us back to a more personal and emotional time. This story takes place between Saw 1 and Saw 2, right as John is trying to find alternative methods to help cure his brain cancer, since the American health system has failed him. Despite his insurance not covering this treatment, he decides to pay $250,000 out of pocket for a chance at survival. However, the supposed doctors that he puts his trust into only pretend to perform the brain surgery. Tied up in a warehouse together, the medical team watches as they each complete their tasks one by one. And these traps are so much fun and pay homage to the entire franchise yet again. The leg saw off is definitely my favorite in this movie, and one of my favorite in the franchise altogether. The brain surgery is likely not something that could happen in real life, but I sure did enjoy watching it on screen. We've also got the amazing eyeball trap with the breaking of the fingers. Watching Gabriella break her wrist and her ankle made me hold my breath. And seeing Diego beat his trap put faith back into Kramer's methods and his compassion. And the number of nods to the previous film is almost impossible to count because there are so many. And it's nice to see a different side of Amanda in this one instead of the drunk with power Amanda that we saw in Saw 3. Seeing her compassion for Gabriella like she had for Daniel in Saw 2 was sweet to see. While she truly wants to learn everything she can from Kramer, she still has a lot to overcome in order to be a true follower of his teachings. Kramer's philosophy, which draws a lot from Eastern philosophy and Christianity, is easily understood and almost justifiable in this installment. These people have robbed those who are essentially on their deathbed of their life savings, leaving them to die without dignity, and they have no remorse for what they're doing. Gabriella arguably does. At the end of Saw 10, it is not hard to be Team Kramer and Amanda. So Saw 10 is going to definitely also go under best. And of course, you already know what it is. Coming in at number 1 is none other than the OG film itself, Saw, baby, from 2004. So James Wan and Lee Whannell started working on Saw after they graduated film school in Australia. They were inspired by low-budget films like The Blair Witch Project and Darren Aronofsky's Pi, so they set out to make something that they would be able to fund themselves. But they soon found out that they would need additional outside funding to bring what they had in mind to life. So they shot a short film called Saw, which was a scene from the script that featured the reverse bear trap and Billy the Puppet, which is the exact puppet that they use in the feature-length film. The short got the attention of the producers at Twisted Pictures, who then gave them about $1 million to shoot the feature-length film. Saw doesn't show a whole lot of blood and guts, but what we do see is enough to make us squirm in our seats. The dark, dingy atmosphere alone was frightening and creepy. The relationships between the characters were built in such a way that the tension is slowly built scene by scene, which leads up to a finale that's completely unexpected. Adam and Dr. Gordon are both victims of Kramer, but at times are at odds with each other. Other times they work together. Sing and Tap get so close to finding out who Jigsaw is just to die. And watching that whole storyline is just heartbreaking. Danny Glover does an excellent job in his role as Detective Tap. And Zepp? He's just a pawn who is actually a sort of co-worker of Dr. Gordon. The editing provided a visceral movie-watching experience and created a sense of urgency and dread. We also get really cool transitions from one location to another that was mostly done practically, a technique we see used throughout the franchise. As I mentioned before, Saw has a lot more heart than Hostel and other torture movies out there. I've had people tell me that it's easier for them to watch Hostel than it is to watch Saw, and that's likely because it plays on your emotions more. The later Saw movies do get a bit more bloody, but there is still a story behind the traps and the games that make you think and feel something for those characters having to play those games. And the theme song, Hello Zepp, absolute perfection, the perfect cherry on top for this movie. Strings are always terrifying, but then you add the sound of pipes banging after spending an hour and a half in that dingy ass bathroom. That is just genius. So with that being said, Saw will also go under Best. And with that, I cannot wait for the release of Saw 11. Y'all know it's coming. Well, there you have it, Stardust. My ranking of the Saw franchise. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Share your ranking list with me down in the comments. I'd love to see where you put the latest Saw movie. Well, thank you again for joining me today, fellow Stardust. I appreciate you being here with me. And I will be taking a little bit of a break, but I will be back sometime in November with some movie reviews of some Indian horror movies. So, if you haven't already, go ahead and hop on the Rainbow Fright Freight Train and hit that subscribe button along with the notification bell. That way you'll get notified every time I upload a new video. I hope I see you next time. Peace.